You're listening to a podcast by the Center for Action and Contemplation. To learn more, visit cac.org.
I started to think, what artifacts are left from my family, and grieving that there really aren't many, and then feeling this momentum in me to start trying to excavate, to start trying to preserve what memories we could. And so I started interviewing people in my family. And along the way, I'll say just the practice of preserving memory has shown me something about myself. What histories am I keen to keep, and what histories would I rather remain hidden? Am I less inclined to draw into? I learned something about myself just in the practice of becoming my own historian in a way.
This podcast explores the mystery of relatedness as an organizing principle of the universe and of our lives.
We're trying to catch a glimpse of connections beyond color, continent, country, or kinship. And we're going to do this through science, mysticism, spirituality, and the creative arts.
I'm Donny Bryant.
I'm Barbara Holmes, and this is The Cosmic We. Today, we want to welcome Cole Arthur Riley. Raised and educated in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Riley is the author of This Here Flesh, an examination of contemplation in the midst of the embodiment of Blackness, family, and community. She's also the creator of Black Liturgy, an Instagram space for exploring prayer, contemplation, lament, and rage. Riley describes herself as a writer, speaker, seeking a deeply contemplative life marked by embodiment and emotion. She also serves as the content and spiritual formation manager at Chester House, a center for Christian studies at Cornell University. Welcome, Cole.
Thanks for having me.
You're a new voice in the area of contemplation. And I just wanted to know if you could identify the source of your spirituality.
I think so, yeah. I wasn't raised in a overtly religious home, but I say in hindsight, I think my household spirituality kind of surrounded things like storytelling and humor and myth even. There's a lot of myth telling in the Arthur family. We have this kind of family mantra, I would say, of pay attention. From the time I was very young, my father would always, say, look up, pay attention, where's home from here? Or what was the waitress's name? And there was always this kind of guiding us into the exterior world and also our own interior worlds, this attentiveness.
The story that you offer in This Here Flesh is a tapestry of memories and invites people in. I was completely swept up. It's not my story. And yet it's being told so respectfully. And it's arising in a way that you can't help but be encompassed by it. The spirituality that you're referencing, because Bible verses keep cropping up in the story, and they're grounded in traditional biblical foundations, but yet they soar beyond what you were given in terms of biblical interpretation.
Yeah. So when I went to college, a little bit in high school, but mostly in college, that was when I first encountered a Christian education, at least in a meaningful way. I'd been to some church services before that, but it was really in college that I entered into a Christian tradition. And so the book has a bit of that in there. That's where I've made a home. And so I wanted to kind of bridge these worlds, like honoring the spirituality of my household growing up and kind of merging that with, how I've been formed since and along the way, which, yeah.
And out of that, what I saw was a very expansive God. I mean, you're using the feminine, the male, the non-binary modifiers for God. And you do it in such a comforting and fluid way. I remember going to seminary and having them tell me, God's not a guy. Stop saying he. And so what they offered me instead was what they call gender inclusive language for God in all of God's whatever. Mm-hmm. And it was weird. And so, I would have to switch back and forth in church. But the ways in which you use feminine, male, non-binary, they, theirs, creates this image of God that is so expansive. Is this how you've always viewed God?
I wish I had always viewed God this way. And thanks for using that language of, expanding, expansive. Even before I went to church, I viewed God as a white man.
We all did.
Right. It's so hard to pinpoint exactly where it began. I definitely think it was affirmed once I started to go to church. But even before church, I had this image of God as a white man in my mind. And to date, even you can cognitively understand that something isn't true, but it just doesn't fully, it's not always fully alive in you as truth, I think. And so, even today I still have trouble reminding myself, no, who are you envisioning? Who are you speaking to right now? And so I think it's always gonna require a bit of resistance in me to kind of contend with the white male God. But I wanted to use kind of gender expansive language without kind of, beating it into people. I just wanted it to be true to what I was feeling in the moment or how I was experiencing the divine in a moment. And so I honestly tried not to think too much about it. I was like, if I overthink this, then it will almost become less fluid, and I'll use, the sacred feminine only when I'm talking about God in the kitchen or God, as a seamstress. If I overthought it, I think I would have really kind of ruined it a bit. So I just tried to go with what I was sensing in myself. And I was hoping that the reader would experience that as a freeing feeling as opposed to a demand on them.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you to maybe expand on that. What were some of your motivations behind writing This Here Flesh? As I took a journey, I felt like I was on a journey, listening to your stories and listening to how you view the world and from a contemplative perspective. But what were some of your motivations, and what were some of your intentions, and what did you want the audience to get from this journey that you were taking us on within your body of work?
I'd been interviewing my different elders in my family for some time. And I started with my father and my grandma, and seeing how much kind of interplay there was between their stories and my own story. By the time I went to write this book, I just felt like our stories were all just kind of tangled up in each other. And I couldn't really write about myself without writing about my father. I couldn't write about my father without writing about his mother. And it just became, I think this bond between our stories just became so strong that it was hard to extract those things. And so I just leaned into it and thought, anyway, I want to communicate a spirituality that's intergenerational, that values the ancestors, that values intergenerational self. And so, I decided to just ground the book in that. I thought I was going to write this very serious book of, Christian contemplation. And in some ways, there certainly is contemplation that kind of resembles the contemplative tradition. But if I was going to honor myself and who I am as a writer, I was going to need to bring in this kind of story element into it.
There's a respectfulness about the ways in which you talk about very, very sensitive stories, particularly your grandmother's trauma, that really pulls people in. I'm always uncomfortable when people start telling stories that have been hidden for so long in ways that have sharp edges. As a writer, you know what I'm talking about. It just bursts out and slashes at your ability to hear. And these seem to drift up in a way that was for the community to hold. You talk about your grandmother's trauma and the tearing of paper, which is reflective of like the rending of her soul. And the community's response is to give her the paper needed to tear. It's the way the community responds to the trauma that you seem to have a real good hold on. Could you say a bit about that?
I mean, honestly, I hadn't thought about that before you just said it, but that is so beautiful to think about it that way, to think that there was some kind of response, even if they didn't immediately understand, what was maybe distinct about my grandma and kind of the sorrow that she contained, that they would do something to keep her from tearing herself apart. My grandma, she would tear at her lips, she would, tear at her skin or anything. And so, yeah, I love thinking about that kind of communal response of being kind of tender, but undemanding, not asking her to go there, to tell her everything, all the reasons why she is the way she is, but to just see her who she is now and try to rise to meet that. So I think that's really beautiful. Yeah, and then as to the handling of stories, I thankfully just love my father and my grandma so much that someone asked me the other day, like, who is this book written for? Well, people keep asking me that, actually. Like, who's the audience? And I never really know what to say. But the other day I thought, if I'm really being honest, when I was writing, I wasn't thinking about some kind of imagined audience. I was thinking about my family. Like, they were my audience. How am I going to preserve these stories for the people that will come after me, from, my children, if I have them, for my children's children? Like, how am I going to really honor these stories? And then how am I going to honor my grandma? And so when I was writing, you talk about this kind of like sharp way. Sometimes people communicate stories. Maybe it's because they've taken, the subject out of their audience. They've extracted them. And so, if I'm writing about my grandma's trauma, I'm going to write it as if she's in front of me, as if she's sitting on the bed next to me, and what kind of delicacy that requires to do her story justice while caring for her. Yeah.
Right. In her presence. Because I remember them asking Toni Morrison the same question. Why don't you write about, who's your audience? Why don't you write about white people? Why are you always writing about Black people? And there's a way in which their dominance wants the story to be about them, even when it isn't about them. And Toni's response was that she wrote, like you said, out of her own context, out of her own community. She wrote the stories that arose up from her, just like you're writing the stories that arise from you. And what it also helps with is the ways in which abuse manifests. It's not always in the same way. There is a gentleness about your writing that is just breathtaking to me.
Cole, in one of your chapters, you talk a lot about memory and the impact of memory. Could you speak a little bit more about how reflections and reflecting and insight plays a role in just allowing us to be able to experience a sense of belonging, a sense of identity, and even how that plays a role in just who we are in the existence of within a community of people?
Well, now I'm thinking about Toni Morrison, and in the site of memory, she's writing about how at that point there were a lot of narratives coming out around, a lot of storytelling around enslaved people, but not a lot that kind of did justice to the interior life of someone who was enslaved. And she talked about having this practice of imagination around the interior worlds of her ancestors, which I think is really beautiful. But she says, they are my entrance. They are my entrance into my own interior life. You could also think of Alice Walker as well, how simple a thing it seems that to know ourselves as we are, we must know our mother's names. And I think what they're both communicating in their own way is this kind of, what memory can do, how memory can serve in terms of exploring my own inner world, in terms of becoming honest about my own identity and who I am and how I've been formed. I kind of have to become a keeper of memory, a preserver. So I mentioned I had been interviewing different people in my family. I was doing that, long before the book process started, because I started to realize, so many of my friends, my husband actually, his family, they have books and books of history. He's a white man, Irish and British lineage, and they have books and books of history and these little notes and these diaries and journals. I started to think, what artifacts are left from my family, and, grieving that there really aren't many, and then feeling this kind of, this momentum in me to start trying to excavate, to start trying to preserve what memories we could. And so I started interviewing people in my family because, and along the way, I'll say, I don't mean to sound like overly cliche, but I do think I learned who I am in a different way. I do think hearing what, my grandma has traveled through, shows me who I am. I also think just the practice of preserving memory has shown me something about myself. What histories am I keen to keep, and what histories would I rather remain hidden? Am I less inclined to draw into? Like, I learned something about myself just in the practice of, becoming my own historian in a way. Yeah.
You created a Black liturgies. For Toni Morrison, the healing begins in the clearing, when the community becomes to cry and to dance. So is social media the clearing for this generation to talk about Black liturgies? What worked for you with that and what didn't?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I've never thought of it that way. So I'll start with the positive, because I tend to just rag on social media a lot. But, in some ways, maybe it is a clearing for some people. I think of maybe queer people who are living in violent areas, or people of color who are kind of trapped in white dominated spaces and who just don't have the kind of privilege of physical proximity to people who are like them, to people who feel safe to them. And so in that way, I don't want to, completely dismiss that social media can serve some kind of serve as kind of a meaningful space of gathering. But I personally, as a queer person, as a Black person, haven't found that to be true for me, just because there's so much, the clearing, I guess it was loud, but I think something about social media is just so loud to me that it's really hard to distinguish the voices that I'm, really seeking. And you don't really have as much control over who's invading the clearing, and so that's really complicated for me. So I think about the space of Black liturgies, for example, which I was hoping to be kind of this, collective space for grief, for laughing, for the Black body, and it has been that in many ways. But also I now have I can't control who follows me, right? So,
right.
At a certain point, all of these really well-meaning white people, some of them lovely, some of them really looking for absolution, started to flock to the space. And I'm still trying to make sense of that for myself. I think there's beauty in it, but also it changes the space, to have kind of white voices, the pressure of the white gaze on me as a writer, as well as the white voice in comments and things like that. So that's just an example of, I don't think social media can be a true harbor. It can't be a true hush harbor, because it's just so loud, and you just can't. I've put so many controls in place. I don't even have a smartphone, and even I feel like this just cacophony when I go on my laptop or use my husband's phone. So complicated answer to that one, I guess.
Well, you're touching something in Black liturgies that the white gaze can't ignore. And I'm not sure, but that contemplative storytelling may be the only way to confront white fragility, because it allows the stories to arise. I was reading some of the reviews, and many of the readers said that they were just drawn to tears, that they were confused, that many of the dominant culture folks didn't know what to do with their own emotions. as I confronted your storytelling. And it occurred to me that they might be confronting their own fragility around issues of race. What do you think?
I would love for that to be the case. I have been too terrified to read any of the reviews, but I'm told they're not too bad.
They're wonderful.
And yeah, I've had some people like message me and say, "Man, I've been crying. I want to read your book, but every time I read a page, I start to cry, and I think, what have I done?" But in some ways, like good, because so many of us are living these emotionally, constricted lives, and certainly in the dominant culture, living these emotionally restricted lives. And I do resonate with a lot of like contemplative writing, a lot of even like academic writing on topics of things like lament and justice. Like I resonate with that. But there's just something to story, I think, that does something distinct for certain people, at least. I could talk about lament, or I could take you to my grandma on the linoleum floor and put a face to the human experience of a thing, as opposed to just talking about the human experience of a thing. And so depending on the person, maybe, but at least most people in my life tend to be drawn to story.
Many of us feel increasing anger at injustice, violence, and indifference in our world today. Join us March 14th for What Do I Do With My Anger? An online gathering featuring Richard Rohr and Brian McLaren. Learn ways of transforming anger into loving action, inspired by Father Richard's new book, The Tears of Things. Register today at cac.org/anger. That's cac.org/ANGER.
You're engaged with a lot of young people in your role as spiritual, like teacher, director. What are the stories that are not being told, that need to be told, that young people are struggling with?
This is a very general answer, but I think like stories of nuance, I think we're really lacking. My generation and younger, we're lacking a lot of, like I read Toni Morrison's work now, and there's so much nuance. Or for example, I watched the famous interview between James Baldwin and Nikki Giovanni again the other day. And I noticed like there was so much kind of push and pull in them, so much mutual respect at first that allowed them to kind of have the relational capital to say, no, I'm going to challenge you on that, or no, I'm going to push back on that. And it led to like such nuance, such a nuanced conversation. And I think it's rare for me to encounter those types of conversations anymore. Conversations where there's so much kind of goodwill that's been nurtured that people can speak kind of freely. People can push and pull and not be too offended or threatened relationally. And it's been very hard to find kind of complicated portraits of a human, I think. Well, they're not really, if you look, they're there, but I think at least on social media, we certainly don't see those. Nuance does not win. Nuance never wins on social media.
I did want to follow up on a point that you were discussing about the power of story, and how, even piggybacking off Barbara's mentioning of how positive and how wonderful some of the comments were and responses were to your work, to the book. One of the things that as I started to really think about the human experience as a shared experience, and as Barbara brought out, that there was some, maybe how you use story and how even you laid out the chapters. I mean, when I look out how, belonging, repair, place, I mean, the chapters were laid out very intentionally, very strategically. And I think there is a universal, there's kind of a cosmic, if you will, aspect to how you wove your family story throughout those chapters. And could you speak to how maybe what you were thinking about, how you laid out the chapters and how you maybe envisioned your story possibly bringing us into maybe seeing ourselves, maybe experiencing kind of that internal revelation about how not only this is my story, but how my story is also a universal story?
As far as the chapters, I knew I wanted to end at liberation. I knew I wanted the flow of the book to feel like it was in journey to this, final chapter on liberation. And I knew that I wanted to start at dignity because I just had been reading so many things, so many things where, the book was reduced to Black pain. And that was kind of the origin story of Blackness was, pain. And I knew that because I was going to be talking about, some serious traumas in my family, I wanted to be careful that the book couldn't be reduced to that. And so I wanted to ground it in, things like dignity, something that feels most true about the Black origin, as opposed to where we're just naturally inclined to go, which is kind of the sad and the dramatic. And anyways, dignity is very dramatic, but in a different way, I guess. So yeah, I knew I wanted to start at dignity to kind of ground people in this belief that, this is a journey that, maybe I was talking to myself, this is a journey that you're prepared to take, Cole. Like, you deserve to take this journey. You have inherent worth. And so, let's go there. Let's do this. And let's talk about your family's stories with the dignity they deserve. So I started to everything else I just pieced together in between, dignity to liberation and what are the kind of, what's the trajectory in between. And of course, the middle sections kind of become where a lot of pain comes through with fear and lament and rage. And then we kind of start cycling back down through repair and memory and joy even. And not a bit an intentional arc there, I would say. When you talk about the stories of my family and how they might transcend, I think it's so interesting. Since I started Black Liturgies, I'm realizing it really is, I'm not the first to say this, it really is particularity that I think people resonate with, in terms of what it's almost a paradox. You think that to speak to the masses, you have to talk in this kind of mass way and kind of strip it of its particularity. But what I'm finding is maybe a little bit of what you were saying, Dr. Holmes, people encountering themselves in the words, almost the more particular you are, the more human it becomes. And I think people recognize human, and so they're able to see themselves in it.
I like the fact that you include rage as, one of the chapters. Contemplatives aren't supposed to get angry.
Right.
They're not. They're supposed to be peaceful no matter what. And yet what you identify is the displacement of rage that is so poisonous, that is so deleterious to our health. I mean, I'm still mad about Trayvon Martin. I'm not supposed to be mad about that. I'm supposed to be over that. I'm not over it. I'm the mother of 2 sons. I'm never going to be over that. And so basically what you say is, tell them I'm not the one. And it's all right to say that. Tell me a little bit about how you dealt with the whole idea of being contemplative and handling the rage that trauma inflicts upon people of color all the time.
It was hard. It's not natural for me. Not that I don't have a natural anger. It's just I'm really good at disguising it. And, I've been made to feel guilty about it. Or I feel like if I express it, I worry that I'll just be painted out to be an angry Black woman and, be reduced to it. And so for a long time in my life, I've just kind of tried to stay away from it, stay away from expressing it in any kind of meaningful way. Of course, it was living in me somewhere, it had to go somewhere. And so as a contemplative, it's been complicated because you want to belong to this tradition, but also I want to be true to, the words of contemplatives, which are that, that people matter, that human life matters, that human life has meaning, that human life should be protected. And so why can't my emotional experience affirm, what contemplatives have been saying? You've said it. My emotional experience is just affirming it. That should be a beautiful thing, but it's not seen as that. And I think because, there's such this risk, because we've seen what anger can do, especially white anger, the anger of an oppressor, the anger of a tyrant, that is almost kind of loudest in our minds when we think of it. Like, that's the portrait we have. And I've started to really interrogate that no, I actually have, portraits of healthy and dignified anger that's in protection of something. And so maybe that's kind of the switch is your anger in protection of some piece or person of creation? And if so, I like to think there's something beautiful, there's something sacred in that, it's difficult to communicate. But that there are people in my life who I've seen them do it and I've seen them be punished for it.
What dominant culture can't understand is that you actually can do your job, go to work, remain calm, and still be angry, and still have the righteous ability to say that was not right, and nothing will make that right. The way you relate that to Jesus is very, very interesting, because what you basically say is that we don't need a stoic savior. What are we doing with a savior who doesn't show pain or lament? What about that angry savior who turns over the tables, and curses the fig tree? Don't we want a little bit of that?
Mm-hmm. I work with, college students, and I started to ask them recently, can you give me some instances of Jesus being nice in scripture? And then ask them with these different kind of emotional affects. And it's so interesting to watch us kind of scramble, grasp for this, portrait of a nice Jesus. I'm I just don't know. I'm sure he was at times, but, the stories that I read he seems very mysterious. He seems a bit snarky. He seems a bit skeptical. There are all these other kind of dispositions that I go to before, I go to the niceness of God or the happiness of Jesus. And so I've started to really question that kind of pressure I feel to be happy, to be positive. I'm okay, if they want me to model Christ, then, I'll be crying all night. I'll cry for a night through. I'll, this beautiful embodied act of anger in the temple. I love that. It's Jesus in his body. He physically overturns tables, which he doesn't just say, I'm angry, which is what we're expected to do now under the guise of civility. It's not really civility. They just want you, bound up. I don't see that in Jesus. It's this very, embodied act.
I think your snarky Jesus is very liberating. There's an interesting phrase that you use in the chapter on liberation. You say liberation depends on reconciliation with ourselves, not necessarily one another. What does that entail?
I think sometimes we can't reconcile with each other. One party might be unwilling. No one person fully has control over reconciliation in their spiritual practice. You need someone else to kind of come to the table, so to speak. So I started to think well, do I have access to liberation apart from that then? If this person won't apologize, if this person isn't interested in making repair, if what does liberation look like for us, for those of us who will never receive an apology, who will never have a meaningful reconciling moment? And that's what made me start to think about, okay, what have I experienced? I've experienced this kind of coming home to myself, this kind of befriending of the self and my body again. I talk about my chronic health issues in the book a bit and how that led me to turn against my body. But I think in many different ways I'm not unique in this. being formed in kind of a spiritual practice of self-hatred. I think many of us who have been formed to hate ourselves, and reconciliation for me has been look like, coming to resist that and kind of lavish love on myself or receive love that I didn't feel like I deserved to receive. And I think something happens, like this union with one's own soul, with one's interior life, when you feel like, whether or not you believe we have a true self or not, I guess isn't the point. But this, at least this kind of feeling that one is being as honest about what they think their true self is, as they can be, as honest as they can be about what they think. I think there's something so liberating about that. Like I have been in spaces where I've had to pretend to believe a certain thing, to like certain things. And when you finally meet yourself and really are able to encounter that in truth, I think, that those have been my most liberating moments, if I'm honest.
Is that what you mean by defiant rootedness?
I just can't believe you read my book. I can't believe I'm talking to you. Wow. You know what? Yeah, I do think that's a kind of defiant rootedness to say, even, when I feel dislocated, even when I feel disconnected, like I'm going to resist a complete aimlessness. I'm going to resist a complete wandering and always kind of return, always kind of be rooted in my own selfhood. While, of course, having an imagination, as Toni Morrison said, this practice of an imagination for other people's interior lives. But I want to ultimately be kind of defiantly rooted in who I am or who I believe myself to be.
The deep understanding you had of your father was such a blessing. To be able to interweave the frailty, the hair braiding, the just belovedness of a parent who is not infallible, but who is necessary and who undergirds the entire story was just wonderful.
Oh, I love my father. I mean, he still is like more superhero than he should be to me. I'm like, no one is a hero, but truly that, if I'm being honest, that's still kind of the category I can place him in. But yeah, in a similar way of wanting to tell my grandma stories as if she's kind of sitting in the room with me, I wanted to do the same with him. And, we're a very private family, so it's a big step for us to like kind of have these stories out, It's one of the strangest things. My dad, he can't even read the book, he just cries, but yeah, he can't even read it. It's so unusual, for us to practice this kind of public telling. And so I really wanted to be sure I was protecting him and honoring him, as a Black man, so that no one could kind of transfigure him into anything less than what he is, which is beautiful and funny and smooth and yeah. Mm-hmm.
We didn't have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that, Reverend Tutu had in South Africa. But with these public tellings, private people are allowing the stories to rise to the surface. And it's going to change the culture. Because once the stories are told, they can't be unheard. It will change history, I believe. So this is an amazing contribution to that public telling.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Is there anything else that you want the audience to know about the work, about yourself, or about your future projects?
Only that I hope if you read this here flesh, that you experience it, not as answers, not as any kind of problem solving or me trying to tell you what to believe, but I really hope you experience it as a kind of opening into your own thoughts and beliefs, or this kind of invitation to ask the same questions that I'm asking, usually with not much of an answer, but more of a kind of portrait of the human experience. So I hope people experience it that way. Yeah, and thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here, Cole.
Thank you, Cole.
Thanks for listening. We'd like to leave you with the reflection from this episode. My takeaway was that liturgy doesn't have to be formal and churchy language, which is what I always encountered. Because if we're really going to be true to the human experience, we have to pray out of our own stories, our personal, our collective trauma, and our blessings. And we're going to do this because basically we're story people. And we have stories, we have family stories, we have secrets, we have angst. And if we don't know our stories, then we don't know ourselves. One of the things that Riley talked about was the ways in which she told her family secrets. Because in this era of reality television, when personal stories are told to shame folks and to expose and ridicule, she invited us to tell the stories as if that vulnerable person was sitting right there. You're going to tell that story completely differently. And so what I ask you is, what is your story? What is the story that you can celebrate? Your family story of triumph or lament, pain, loss. Despite those stories, can you remain defiantly rooted no matter what?
Do you feel called to walk a more contemplative path? The Center for Action and Contemplation is an educational nonprofit supporting the journey of inner transformation. Our programs and resources will help grow your consciousness, deepen your prayer practice, and strengthen your compassionate engagement with the world. Learn more about our resources, such as publications, podcasts, email series, and events at www.cac.org.